But most of us don't know that history well enough to realize that Black Americans are indigenous. Mainstream sources provide us with mathematical evidence that the same population we now call African Americans is the population we used to call Indians. African slaves were genuinely brought here. It's just that their numbers were much smaller than those of the indigenous populations with whom they mixed. This is arguably the most mainstream data source you can possibly find for information on the transatlantic slave trade. Period. If the white man was trying to trick you into believing you came from Africa, don't you think it would behoove them to add a 0 to this figure? Maybe even 2?
Wake up out of your sleep.
I must implore all Black people in America to stop relying on conspiracy theories to explain that we're indigenous to this land. The story was not told in reverse. We did not enslave Europeans and bring them here. Neither Israel nor the Garden of Eden are in the Americas. Whites did not trick us into believing we were Africans. Native Americans are not Mongolians who came and replaced us. The transatlantic slave trade was a real thing, and it was every bit as atrocious as mainstream history admits it was. That same mainstream history actually admits that we're the American Indians, but most of us don't know that history well enough to realize that Black Americans are indigenous. We're gonna use exclusively mainstream sources today, and we're gonna piece together a mainstream narrative of slavery in the United States. You will soon see that the indigeneity of Black people in the United States is a little-known mainstream fact. Firstly, the Slave Voyages database is the fruit of a multinational project confected by the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Omohundro Institute, and 6 universities in the United States and West Indies. Since 2015, it has enabled hundreds of years of research to be sorted for historically unparalleled analysis, albeit somewhat complicated for lay users for its sheer volume of data points. This is arguably the most mainstream data source you can possibly find for information on the transatlantic slave trade. Period. Regional disembarkation data shows only an estimated 388,747 slaves from Africa ever landed on mainland North America from 1501 to 1875. Like literally the whole slave trade. If the white man was trying to trick you into believing you came from Africa, don't you think it would behoove them to add a 0 to this figure? Maybe even 2? I mean, it's a conspicuously diminutive stat. It does a terrible job of deceiving the 40+ million Black Americans living today that they're Africans. This underwhelming figure falls wildly short of not only the millions that one might expect, but also short of the 1860 census record of 4.4 million colored slaves and free coloreds approaching emancipation. Meanwhile, the Census Bureau is telling you that this is less than 1/10 of how many colored people there were at the time of emancipation. Think about that. There's nothing more mainstream than the government itself. The Census Bureau is a federal government agency. It's part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is one of the executive bodies of the U.S. government. So from the top, the government is providing us with the statistical data we need to demonstrate that the Black population was suspiciously large in 1860. It took from 1619 to 1860 to even bring the majority of this 388,747 people here.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, You can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
On the 1860 census, it just says colored people, not Negroes or black people. Because of this, the average Native American might say, well, how do you know which colored people were black and which ones were Indians? They called us colored too. That only helps our argument honestly, because if you're suggesting that this colored population actually bifurcates into two separate groups, then you admit that a lot of the coloreds were Indians, which is our whole point. Just to be clear though, the people called colored then are the people called African American today. We can look at this 1992 peer-reviewed journal article to prove it if we need to. It was published by Tom Smith through Oxford University Press into an academic journal called The Public Opinion Quarterly. Oxford University Press is arguably the most mainstream publisher in the history of American literature. The title takes it as a given that a single demographic was first called colored, then Negro, then black, and then African American. The colored population has always been only those of very dark complexion and tightly coiled hair. We should not be perpetuating a conspiracy theory that Euro-Americans somehow lied and convinced us that we're from Africa without there ever having been a real transatlantic slave trade. If they were that much smarter than us, then they earned their place as our masters. Only an inferiority complex could believe that the white man literally ran circles around our ancestors like that. No, African slaves were genuinely brought here. It's just that their numbers were much smaller than those of the indigenous populations with whom they mixed. Their numbers were so much smaller that the phenotype of the so-called African American has to be determined primarily by Aboriginal DNA. The African contribution to this gene pool would be minuscule. To be fair, the African American slave population should be expected to increase markedly by the time of the 1860 census. Countless accounts confirm slave breeding as chattel praxis for the manufacture of child slaves. Mainstream history does maintain that slave breeding was just such a rampant practice that white people exponentially increased our birth rate by constantly impregnating our women to make new slaves. However, the problem with using this high birth rate to explain how the entire demographic can be African is that research on this has struggled to make it plausible to date. In a study published in 2020, Dr. J. David Hacker at the University of Minnesota found that slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population. This means that our population grew faster in the 1800s than any human population could be expected to grow based on the stats he and other historians have compiled. He also goes through a litany of other demographic historians who agree with him that the birth rates in these decades are almost impossibly massive. Hacker's study concedes this without even bringing up the fact that males also outnumbered females almost 3-to-1 among African slaves, further impinging upon the African American population's ability to procreate at this nigh unprecedented rate. In other words, who would white men rape to raise the slave numbers this high so fast? What the study does acknowledge is that child-to-woman ratios leapt wildly for the slave population in the Chesapeake region from the 1660s to the 1780s, in ways only explained by a serendipitous confluence of slave fertility increasing and slave child mortality declining simultaneously. Put simply, the slave population boom even before the 1800s could only be possible if slaves miraculously got inhumanly fertile, while enslaved babies just never died of anything ever, which is equally miraculous, especially considering they were slaves in a society that didn't value their lives at all. It's worth noting that, until 1700, New England colonies trafficked very few slaves from Africa, but enslaved more and more Indians, shipping many to the West Indies and Europe. What does all this mean? It means that mainstream sources provide us with mathematical evidence that the same population we now call African Americans is the population we used to call Indians. There were no other colored people in North America besides Indians and Africans, but Africans comprised approximately 10% of that colored population. That percentage could be higher based on slave breeding, but that would only account for another small percentage of the colored population. Even if it doubles the African segment of the colored demographic, we still end up with only 1 in 5 colored Americans having African descent at the time of emancipation. This population would still be 80% indigenous. Meanwhile, what percentage of carded Native Americans do you think are genuinely more indigenous than European? We should honor them for preserving our cultures and heritages for us all this time, but we do have to acknowledge that Native Americans are more European than Aboriginal. Whereas when you look at us, you're looking at the autochthonous phenotype. Only after you understand all this overlooked mainstream information can you also understand why Native American talk show host Jay Winter Nightwolf told Minister Louis Farrakhan that black Americans might be predominantly Indians.
If you were to walk into any mosque in America and you just laid your hands on the first person or the third person or the fifth person that you see, you realize that you're laying your hands on a Native American?
I believe
there were only 8% of the slaves that came to America. So how is it that there are so many more people that they claim are black or African Americans? I think they got the numbers wrong, because a lot of Native Americans are the ones that they're counting as black folks too.
well we're really one.
Yeah.